Dr. Julian Reeves was an evolutionary anthropologist who spent his career searching for the missing link in human cognitive development. What he discovered would reveal the most tragic loss in human history, the moment when humanity abandoned its natural telepathic abilities. Julian's breakthrough came while analyzing ancient skull fragments from a site in Turkey dating back 12,000 years. The cranial structure showed an unusual development in the temporal lobe region that modern humans no longer possessed. This extinct neural architecture suggested capabilities far beyond what contemporary neuroscience considered possible for prehistoric humans. Julian's research team conducted comparative analysis across hundreds of ancient specimens and found a clear pattern. Humans who lived before 10,000 years ago had significantly different brain structures, particularly in areas associated with mirror neurons and electromagnetic field sensitivity. These anatomical features began disappearing around the same time as the rise of the first agricultural societies. Julian theorized that early humans possessed genuine telepathic communication, a direct mind-to-mind transmission of thoughts and emotions that required no spoken language. But something catastrophic had happened to strip this ability away from the entire species. To test his theory, Julian developed an experimental protocol combining transcranial magnetic stimulation with targeted neurochemical cocktails designed to temporarily reactivate dormant neural pathways in the temporal lobe. He recruited 12 volunteers for a controlled study, carefully screening them for psychological stability and obtaining extensive ethical clearances. The experiment would attempt to artificially restore the ancient telepathic brain architecture for brief periods, allowing subjects to experience what their ancestors had naturally possessed. During the first session, nothing remarkable occurred. Subjects reported mild tingling sensations and heightened emotional awareness, but no genuine telepathic connection. Julian adjusted the magnetic field frequencies and neurochemical ratios, pushing closer to the theoretical parameters suggested by his fossil analysis. On the fourth attempt, everything changed. Two subjects, strangers who had never met before the experiment, suddenly locked eyes across the laboratory and began speaking simultaneously, finishing each other's sentences with perfect synchronization, but their expressions showed absolute terror. Julian immediately noticed something disturbing. The subjects weren't just sharing thoughts, they were experiencing complete ego dissolution. The boundary between individual consciousnesses had collapsed entirely, and both subjects were simultaneously experiencing both perspectives at once. One subject began screaming that he could feel himself dying even though he was perfectly healthy, because he was experiencing the other subject's childhood trauma of nearly drowning. The telepathic connection wasn't a gentle sharing of ideas, it was a violent merger of entire identities, memories, and emotional histories. Julian terminated the experiment immediately, but the effects didn't fully reverse. The two subjects remained partially connected for weeks afterward, reporting that they could still sense each other's emotional states and occasionally receive involuntary thought transmissions. Psychiatric evaluation revealed they were both developing severe dissociative disorders, struggling to maintain coherent individual identities when they could feel another consciousness bleeding into their own awareness. Julian realized with growing horror what his research had actually uncovered. The loss of human telepathy hadn't been an evolutionary accident or genetic drift. It had been a deliberate, species-wide adaptation driven by desperate necessity. Julian's deeper investigation into archaeological records revealed a pattern he had initially overlooked. Around 12,000 years ago, there was a dramatic increase in evidence of violence, murder, and what appeared to be mass psychological breakdowns across multiple prehistoric cultures simultaneously. Cave paintings from that era showed disturbing imagery of heads splitting open and people fleeing from invisible forces. Julian theorized that as human populations grew and communities became larger, the telepathic ability that had served small tribal groups became catastrophically dysfunctional. In a village of 500 telepathically connected individuals, every person would experience every other person's thoughts, emotions, traumas, and fears simultaneously. The cognitive load would be incomprehensible, like trying to maintain 500 different conversations in your head at once while experiencing 500 different emotional states overlapping each other. One person's anxiety would amplify across the entire community, feeding back in an exponential loop until the collective psychological state became unbearable. The ancient humans had faced a stark choice: maintain their telepathic abilities and descend into permanent psychological chaos, or find a way to shut down this connection and accept permanent isolation within individual minds. Some unknown group, perhaps shamans or early healers, had discovered a method to suppress the telepathic neural structures. They used a combination of specific plant compounds and ritualistic practices designed to rewire human brain development. This knowledge spread across all human populations with desperate urgency, because the alternative was the complete collapse of human civilization into madness. The suppression technique was crude and irreversible, affecting not just the telepathic abilities but also reducing overall empathic connection between humans. To save the species from telepathic overload, early humans had essentially lobotomized themselves, accepting permanent psychological isolation as the price of sanity. The development of spoken language wasn't a revolutionary advancement, it was a compensation mechanism. Humanity's attempt to rebuild connection after severing the natural telepathic link that had become their greatest curse. Julian's most disturbing discovery came when he analyzed his own brain scans after conducting the experiments. Despite never directly participating in the telepathic sessions, his neural structure had begun changing simply from proximity to the activated subjects. The ancient telepathic pathways were starting to reawaken in his own brain, triggered by some form of resonance effect. He could feel it happening, a growing awareness of thoughts that weren't his own. Fleeting moments where he knew what his research assistant was thinking before she spoke. Brief flashes of experiencing his wife's emotions from across the city. Julian faced an impossible decision. He had proven that human telepathy was real and could potentially be restored through targeted intervention. The implications were staggering. It could revolutionize human communication, eliminate deception, and create unprecedented empathy across the species. But his research had also proven why humanity had abandoned this ability in the first place. Restoring widespread telepathy would require returning to small, isolated communities to prevent psychological overload, essentially dismantling modern civilization and reducing human population to prehistoric levels. The final revelation came when Julian discovered that the suppression of telepathy hadn't been completely successful. Approximately 1 in every 10,000 humans was born with partially intact telepathic neural structures, people who throughout history had been called prophets, mystics, or the mentally ill depending on cultural context. These individuals experienced fragmentary telepathic connections that manifested as hearing voices, sensing others' emotions, or receiving intrusive thoughts. What modern psychiatry treated as schizophrenia and psychosis was actually the ancient telepathic ability manifesting in isolated individuals who lacked the population-wide context that would make these experiences coherent. Julian stood in his laboratory late one night, holding the vial of neurochemical compound that could theoretically reactivate telepathy across entire populations if introduced into water supplies or administered systematically. He thought about his 2 test subjects who were still recovering in psychiatric facilities, their identities permanently fractured by brief exposure to humanity's lost ability. He thought about the cave paintings of ancient humans fleeing from the invisible chaos in their own minds. And he thought about the loneliness that every human carries, the prison of individual consciousness that forces us to remain forever separate from each other, desperately using inadequate words to bridge the unbridgeable gap between isolated minds. Julian destroyed all his research data, published a false study claiming the experiment had failed due to methodological errors, and locked the neurochemical formula in a secure location with instructions for its destruction upon his death. Humanity had made its choice 12,000 years ago, accepting permanent psychological isolation as the price of sanity in a crowded world. Julian would not force them to confront that choice again. Some abilities, he realized, are better left lost, and the moment humans abandoned their natural telepathy wasn't a tragedy to be reversed, but a sacrifice that had saved the species from destroying itself through too much connection, too much unwanted intimacy, and the unbearable weight of experiencing thousands of other consciousnesses as if they were your own.